I hope to give Mr. Thurber the final word on the Galarraga-Joyce imperfect game this week, but there really isn't a story that fits. Thurber's best baseball story, you could look it up, from 1941, posits a team using what has been described as a trash-talking dwarf as a pinch hitter in a game. It's been incorrectly cited as the inspiration for the day a decade later when Bill Veeck of the St. Louis Browns actually sent 3'7" Eddie Goodell in to pinch hit. In fact, Thurber was merely riffing on the story of Jerry Sullivan, a 3'8" comedian who not only got in a game in the minor leagues in Buffalo in 1905, but actually got a hit. Veeck knew the same story. He said that was what had inspired the Goodell game, not Thurber's story. Anyway, none of this has anything to do with perfect games anyway. So again, I'll just select a dandy from the Library of America, Thurber Writings and Drawings, though this one appeared first in Let Your Mind Alone in 1937. You can use either to read this in full. I am abridging it here slightly for time. Now, Sex Ex Machina by James Thurber. With the disappearance of the gas mantle and the advent of the short circuit, man's tranquility began to be threatened by everything he put his hand on. Many people believe that it was a sad day indeed when Benjamin Franklin tied that key to a kite string and flew the kite in a thunderstorm. Other people believe that if it hadn't been Franklin, it would have been someone else. As, of course, it was in the case of the harnessing of steam and the invention of the gas engine. At any rate, it has come about that so-called civilized man find himself today surrounded by the myriad mechanical devices of a technological world. Writers of books on how to control your nerves, how to conquer fear, how to cultivate calm, how to be happy in spite of everything, are of several minds as regards the relation of man and the machine. Some of them are prone to believe that the mind and body, if properly disciplined, can get the upper hand of this mechanized existence. Others merely ignore the situation and go to the profitable writing of more facile chapters of inspiration. Still others attribute the whole menace of the machine to sex, and so confuse the average reader that he cannot always be certain whether he has been knocked down by an automobile or is merely in love. To my notion, the effect of the automobile and of other mechanical contrivances on the state of our nerves, minds, and spirits is a problem which the popular psychologists whom I have dealt with know very little about. The sexual explanation of the relationship of man and the machine is not good enough. To arrive at the real explanation, we have to begin very far back as Franklin and the kite, or at least as far back as a certain man and woman who appear in a book of stories written more than 60 years ago by Max Adler. One story in this book tells about a housewife who bought a combination ironing board and card table, which some New England genius had thought up in his spare time. The husband, coming home to find the devilish contraption in the parlor, was appalled. "What is that thing?" he demanded. His wife explained that it was a card table, but that if you pressed a button underneath, it would become an ironing board. Whereupon she pushed the button and the table leaped a foot into the air, extended itself, and became an ironing board. The story goes on to tell how the thing finally became so finely sensitized that it would change back and forth if you merely touched it. You didn't have to push the button. The husband stuck it in the attic after it had leaped up and struck him a couple of times while he was playing euchre, and on windy nights it could be heard flopping and banging around, changing from a card table to an ironing board and back. The story serves as one example of our dread heritage of annoyance, shock, and terror arising out of the nature of mechanical contrivances per se. The mechanical principle involved in this damnable invention had, I believe, no relationship to sex whatsoever. There are certain analysts who see sex in everything, even a leaping ironing board, but I think we can ignore these scientists. No man, to go on, who has wrestled with a self-adjusting card table can ever be quite the same man he once was. If he arrives at the state where he hesitates, wavers, and jumps at every mechanical device he encounters, it is not, I submit, because he recognizes the enticements of sex in the device, but only because he recognizes the menace of the machine as such. There might very well be, in every descendant of the man we have been discussing, an inherited desire to jump at and conquer mechanical devices before they have a chance to turn into something twice as big and twice as menacing. It is not reasonable to expect that his children and their children will have entirely escaped the stigma of such traumata. I myself will never be the man I once was, nor will my descendants probably ever amount to much, because of a certain experience I had with an automobile. I had gone out to the barn of my country place. a barn which was used both as a garage and a kennel to quiet some large black poodles. It was 1 a.m. of a pitch-dark night in winter, and the poodles had apparently been terrified by some kind of a prowler, a tramp, a turtle, or perhaps a fiend of some kind. Both my poodles and myself believed in the time in fiends, and still do. Fiends who materialize out of nothing and nowhere like winged pigweed or Russian thistle. I had quite a time quieting the dogs because their panic spread to me and mine spread back to them again, a kind of vicious circle. Finally, a hush as ominous as their uproar fell upon them, but they kept looking over their shoulders in a kind of apprehensive way. There's nothing to be afraid of, I told them as firmly as I could, and just at that moment, the klaxon horn of my car, which was just behind me, began to shriek. Everybody has heard a klaxon on a car suddenly begin to sound. I understand it's a short circuit that causes it, but very few people have heard one scream behind them while they were quieting 6 or 8 alarmed poodles in the middle of the night in an old barn. I jump now whenever I hear a klaxon, even in the klaxon in my own car when I push the button intentionally. The experience has left its mark. Everybody from the day of the jumping card table to the day of the screaming klaxon has had similar shocks. You can see the result, entirely unsuperinduced by sex, in the strained faces and muttering lips of people who pass you on the streets of great, highly mechanized cities. There goes a man who picked up one of those trick matchboxes that whir in your hands. There goes a woman who tried to change a fuse without turning off the current. And yonder toddles an ancient who cranked an old Rio with the spark advanced. Every person carries in his consciousness the old scar or the fresh wound of some harrowing misadventure with a contraption of some sort. I know people who would not deposit a nickel and a dime in a cigarette vending machine and push the lever even if a diamond necklace came out. I know dozens who would not climb into an airplane even if it didn't move off the ground. In none of these people have I discerned what I would call a neurosis or an exaggerated fear. I have discerned only a natural caution in a world made up of gadgets that whir and whine and whiz and shriek and sometimes explode. I should like to end with the case history of a friend of mine in Ohio named Harvey Lake. When he was only 19, the steering bar of an old electric runabout broke off in his hand, causing the machine to carry him through a fence and into the grounds of the Columbus School for Girls. He developed a fear of automobiles, trains, and every other kind of vehicle that was not pulled by a horse. Now, the psychologists would call this a complex and represent the fear as abnormal, but I see it as a purely reasonable apprehension. If Harvey Lake had, because he was catapulted into the grounds of the Columbus School for Girls, developed a fear of girls, I would call that a complex. But I don't call his normal fear of machines a complex. Harvey Lake never in his life got into a plane. He died in a fall from a porch, but I do not regard that as neurotic either, but only sensible. I have, to be sure, encountered men with complexes. There was, for example, Marvin Belt. He had a complex about airplanes that was quite interesting. He was not afraid of machinery or of high places or of crashes. He was simply afraid that the pilot of any plane he got into might lose his mind. I imagine myself high over Montana, he once said to me, in a huge, perfectly safe tri-motored plane. Several of the passengers are dozing, others are reading, but I am keeping my eyes glued on the door to the cockpit. Suddenly, the pilot steps out of it, a wild light in his eyes, and in a falsetto like that of a little girl, he says to me, "Conductor, will you please let me off at 125th Street? But, I said to Belt, even if the pilot does go crazy, there's still the co-pilot. No, there isn't, said Belt. The pilot has hit the co-pilot over the head with something and killed him. Yes, the psychoanalyst can have Marvin Belt, but they can't have Harvey Lake, or while I have my strength, me. Sex ex machina. That's Countdown, portions written by James Thurber for this, the 46th day of the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf. I'm Keith Olbermann. Good night and good luck.